The year was 1305, and London's streets rang with the everyday sounds of medieval life. Merchants shouting prices, iron-shod hooves striking stone, carts rattling through narrow lanes. But on this particular morning, those familiar noises were about to be drowned out by something far darker: the roar of a massive crowd assembling for blood. They had come to witness the death of William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had dared to challenge the authority of the English crown and rally his people against foreign domination. What unfolded that day was not simply an execution. It was a meticulously staged display of terror, engineered to annihilate not only a man, but the idea he embodied. Popular culture, shaped by films and romanticized retellings, has softened Wallace's end, portraying it as swift, dignified, even heroic. The truth is far more disturbing. King Edward I, remembered as Longshanks, designed Wallace's punishment as a political weapon. This was not justice, it was spectacle. Edward intended Wallace's death to be so brutal, so public, and so unforgettable that it would echo across generations as a warning to anyone who might dream of defying English rule. The sentence chosen was hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most extreme penalty in medieval England, reserved exclusively for traitors. This punishment was not meant to end life quickly. It was designed to dismantle a human being piece by piece, to strip away dignity, hope, and identity in full view of the public. Wallace's execution was meant to sear itself into memory, to haunt Scotland long after his body was gone. To understand how such cruelty was possible, we must understand the world that produced it. Late 13th century Scotland was a land balanced precariously between independence and conquest. The concept of nationhood was still forming, and allegiance was often dictated by survival rather than ideology. A succession crisis had plunged Scotland into chaos, and Edward I seized the moment, treating the kingdom not as a sovereign realm, but as a rebellious territory to be subdued. William Wallace emerged from this turmoil not as a power-hungry noble, but as a minor landholder driven by grief and fury. His family had suffered under English occupation, and when he rose against Edward's forces, most famously at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, his cause was both personal and national. That victory was more than a military triumph. It shattered the myth of English invincibility, proving that heavy cavalry could be defeated and that Scottish independence was not fantasy, but possibility. Edward understood the danger of symbols, and that is why Wallace could not simply be killed. He had to be destroyed in a way that would make resistance unthinkable. Edward I was not a ruler who tolerated defiance. Known for the brutal suppression of Welsh resistance and the mass expulsion of Jews from England, Longshanks understood rebellion as a contagious force, something that had to be crushed completely before it could spread. Wallace's victories could not simply be undone. They had to be weaponized against him, reshaped into a warning so terrifying that future generations would think twice before lifting a sword against the crown. Edward's objective was clear. Resistance would not just fail, it would be annihilated publicly and without mercy. By 1305, the political landscape made Wallace's fate almost inevitable. Most Scottish nobles had already submitted to Edward's authority, concluding that survival through submission was preferable to extinction. Wallace's refusal to surrender did more than threaten English control. It exposed the moral compromise of Scotland's aristocracy. He was no longer just England's enemy. He was an uncomfortable reminder to Scottish elites of what they had abandoned. His continued defiance undermined the legitimacy of their submission, making his capture a political necessity on both sides of the border. The pursuit of William Wallace stretched on for years, driven by an expanding web of spies, informants, and collaborators. Edward placed a significant bounty on Wallace's head, and English officials in Scotland worked methodically to cut him off from allies. Fear did the rest. One by one, supporters vanished, some bribed, some intimidated, others simply desperate to avoid sharing Wallace's fate. In a world where even suspicion of loyalty to him could mean death, betrayal became a means of survival. As so often happens, the end came from within. In August of 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely betrayed by Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who had sworn loyalty to Edward. While historians still debate the precise details, the result was unmistakable. The figurehead of Scottish resistance was finally in English custody. London celebrated the capture as a triumph, but for Edward, it was merely the opening act of a far more deliberate humiliation. Wallace's transport from Scotland to London was itself a calculated form of torment. Shackled and heavily guarded, he was marched through towns and cities, deliberately exposed to crowds eager to glimpse the man who had defied a king. This was psychological warfare, stripping a national hero of mystique and reducing him to a traveling exhibit. By the time Wallace arrived in London, the man was exhausted, isolated, and fully aware that the spectacle of his suffering had only just begun. By the time Wallace reached London, he had already endured weeks of calculated humiliation, but the worst was still to come. His trial was never intended to determine guilt or innocence. It was a performance, one staged to legitimize an execution that had already been decided. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought before Westminster Hall, the symbolic heart of English law and royal authority. The proceedings were conducted entirely in Latin, a language Wallace almost certainly did not understand, reinforcing the fact that this was not justice, but domination. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and a catalogue of crimes against the English crown. The irony was evident even to contemporaries. Wallace stood accused of betraying a king he had never recognized as his sovereign. When finally allowed to speak, Wallace reportedly declared that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never sworn him allegiance. It was a defiant assertion of Scottish independence, and it ensured that no mercy, however symbolic, would be offered. In reality, the verdict was never in doubt. The judges were Edward's appointees, and the trial existed solely to provide a legal facade for what was, in essence, a political execution. Wallace was not being judged as a combatant in a war, but reframed as a common criminal, stripped of the legitimacy of resistance. The additional charges, particularly those accusing him of sacrilege for attacking English clergy, were carefully chosen to portray him as morally corrupt, not merely rebellious. The sentence was delivered with solemn ceremony. Wallace was condemned to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged until insensible but not dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and finally divided into 4 parts. Each stage of the punishment carried deliberate symbolism. The drawing signified public degradation, the hanging divine rejection, the disembowelment spiritual defilement, and the quartering the total erasure of the man and the cause he represented. This was not execution alone. It was a message, crafted to terrify, to dominate, and to ensure that Wallace's defiance would be remembered not as inspiration, but as a warning. This was not simply an execution. It was annihilation. The morning of August 23, 1305, broke clear and warm over London, as if the city itself were indifferent to what was about to occur. Preparations had been underway for days. Scaffolds were raised, routes cleared, and word spread across the city and beyond that the Scottish rebel would die. Crowds poured in from surrounding towns. Vendors lined the streets selling food and ale. The authorities had transformed Wallace's death into a public spectacle, something closer to a festival than a judicial proceeding. Justice was not the point. Power was. Entertainment was. This was meant to be a living demonstration of what defiance cost. Wallace was stripped and bound to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame used to drag traitors through the streets. Horses pulled him from the Tower of London along a route carefully chosen for maximum exposure, winding through the busiest districts of the city. The stones beneath him were unforgiving. His body scraped across cobblestones, tearing skin and muscle, leaving streaks of blood behind him like a grotesque signature marking his final passage through England's capital. The crowds were a cross-section of medieval society: patriotic loyalists, morbid onlookers, and those drawn simply by the promise of suffering. They jeered, they shouted, they hurled refuse and debris at his body as he passed. None of it was spontaneous. This behavior was encouraged. The humiliation was part of the sentence. What unfolded was state-sponsored cruelty on full display. The procession moved deliberately slowly, ensuring Wallace remained conscious as long as possible and allowing time for the crowd to swell at every turn. Contemporary accounts suggest he never screamed, never pleaded, never begged. Whether this silence was defiance, resignation, or shock is impossible to know. But witnesses remarked on it, and that composure would later be transformed into legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a scaffold had been erected specifically for this killing. The crowd there was larger still, louder, more celebratory. People arrived early to claim vantage points. Food and drink circulated freely. The atmosphere was unmistakably carnival-like, exactly as the authorities intended. Wallace was not meant to die as a martyr. He was meant to die as an example. The executioner, a professional accustomed to death, began with mechanical precision. Wallace was hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned to prevent a quick end. This was strangulation, not mercy. The crowd watched as his body thrashed, his face darkened, his limbs jerked in the involuntary struggle for air. When unconsciousness finally approached, he was cut down, alive, aware, and helpless. What followed was the true core of the punishment. While Wallace was still conscious, the executioner took a blade and opened his abdomen. One by one, his internal organs were removed in front of the crowd. This was not done quickly. This was ritualized destruction, slow, deliberate, and absolute, designed to erase not just a man, but the meaning he carried. Contemporary witnesses later wrote that the screams that followed were unlike anything they had ever heard. Sounds so raw and desperate they seemed to come from the very limits of human endurance. As the executioner worked, he lifted each organ high for the crowd to see before casting it into a fire prepared beside the scaffold. This was no random cruelty. In medieval belief, the bowels were thought to house emotion, compassion, and moral character. By burning Wallace's entrails before his eyes, the execution was meant to erase his humanity itself, reducing him to an object stripped of meaning and dignity. The stench of burning flesh spread across Smithfield, mingling with smoke, sweat, and spilled ale. Even hardened spectators reportedly turned away, overwhelmed by the sensory assault. Yet Wallace remained alive. His eyes stayed open, tracking the movement of the executioner as his body was dismantled piece by piece. Some accounts claim he continued to speak during this final phase, though no record preserves his words. Whether prayer, defiance, or delirium, whatever he said was swallowed by the noise of the crowd and lost to history. The executioner's grim expertise lay not merely in inflicting pain, but in prolonging life. Death was delayed intentionally. Mercy had no place here. Only when the performance had achieved its full effect did the executioner move to end it. With a single, practiced stroke of an axe, Wallace's head was severed. His suffering finally ceased, but the degradation did not. The severed head was lifted high, blood still dripping from the neck, displayed to the crowd as proof that England's most defiant enemy was truly dead. Then the body was cut into 4 quarters, each piece raised and examined like butchered meat. Nothing about this was accidental. Every movement was designed to imprint fear into memory. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as deliberate as the execution itself. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted atop a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years, greeting travelers with a silent warning. The 4 quarters of his body were sent north to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, strategically chosen locations where resistance had once found support. There, they were publicly displayed as physical reminders of what defiance cost. This was not brutality for its own sake. It was political communication. Edward IV understood that symbols could conquer where armies could not. Wallace's dismembered body became a message written in flesh, broadcast across Scotland and England alike. Rebellion would not merely be crushed, it would be erased. In the immediate aftermath, Edward's strategy appeared to succeed. Scottish resistance faltered. Many former supporters fled, surrendered, or went silent, calculating that no cause justified such an end. Wallace, once a symbol of defiance, had been transformed, at least temporarily, into a warning. Edward had badly misjudged the effect Wallace's death would have on Scotland. Instead of extinguishing resistance, the sheer savagery of the execution hardened it. The horror of what had been done to Wallace transformed him from a defeated rebel into a martyr whose suffering gave new life to the cause he left behind. Rather than frightening Scotland into submission, Edward had provided it with a symbol powerful enough to outlive him. Robert the Bruce, who would later claim the Scottish crown, was reportedly galvanized by Wallace's fate. Where others saw terror, Bruce saw revelation. Wallace's execution exposed English rule for what it truly was, not order, but domination enforced through spectacle and cruelty. For men like Bruce, compromise with such a power became morally impossible. The method of Wallace's death reshaped Scottish resistance itself. The message was unmistakable. Capture by the English meant degradation beyond endurance. From that point forward, Scottish fighters increasingly chose death in battle over surrender. Warfare grew more ruthless, more desperate, and more uncompromising. Wallace's execution helped create a culture of no quarter, where mercy was neither expected nor offered, and where resistance became a matter of survival rather than strategy. The repercussions did not stop at Scotland's borders. Across Europe, rulers and chroniclers took note. Wallace's execution was discussed not only as punishment, but as precedent. Other kingdoms saw clearly that the same methods could be turned against them should they fall into English hands. The spectacle contributed to England's growing reputation for calculated brutality, a reputation that would later complicate Edward's diplomacy and isolate his crown. The intended message of strength was received, but so was the message of cruelty. The historical record of Wallace's execution is unusually detailed. Multiple contemporary sources describe the event with striking precision. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, recounts the execution in stark, almost clinical language, noting the crowd's reactions and the length of Wallace's suffering. Though shaped by English bias, these accounts reveal much about medieval concepts of justice, authority, and deterrence. Scottish sources, fewer but deeply influential, tell a different story. John of Forden's Chronicle presents Wallace as a martyr who met death with composure and resolve, emphasizing his refusal to beg for mercy or renounce his cause. While these accounts may carry elements of idealization, they reflect how Wallace's death was absorbed into Scotland's national memory, not as defeat, but as moral triumph. Perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the legal records themselves. Preserved in English archives, the documents surrounding Wallace's trial and execution show meticulous planning at every stage. Charges were carefully worded. Procedures were formally recorded. Even the distribution of his body parts was documented. The English authorities clearly understood that they were not merely executing a man. They were creating history. Eyewitness testimony adds further dimension. Some observers remembered the crowd's enthusiasm, the carnival atmosphere of state-sanctioned violence. Others remarked on Wallace's composure in the face of unimaginable suffering. Together, these accounts capture the full paradox of his death. An execution intended to erase a symbol that instead ensured his immortality. These differing perspectives underscore the complexity of Wallace's execution and the radically different meanings it carried for each audience. What occurred in London in 1305 did not end with Wallace's death. Its consequences rippled outward for centuries, reshaping Scottish identity and political thought far beyond the immediate aftermath. In the generations that followed, Wallace's story hardened into a cornerstone of Scottish national consciousness. The savagery of his execution elevated him from a defeated insurgent to a martyr whose suffering embodied resistance itself. In death, he became far more powerful than he had ever been on the battlefield. His broken body succeeded where armies had failed, providing Scotland with a symbol that could not be erased by force. Wallace's execution also left a mark on legal and moral thinking beyond Scotland. Later scholars would cite his treatment as an example of judicial excess, punishment so extreme that it violated any meaningful notion of human dignity. Gradually, the idea emerged that even enemies of the state were entitled to limits on cruelty. In this sense, Wallace's death contributed indirectly to the slow evolution of concepts that would later underpin international law and human rights. Culturally, the impact was enormous. From medieval ballads and chronicles to novels, paintings, and modern cinema, Wallace's story has been retold across centuries. Each retelling reframed his execution as a symbolic clash between oppression and freedom, tyranny and justice. The scene of his death became a narrative focal point, a moment where brutality and moral resistance collided in unforgettable fashion. For the Scottish people, the psychological impact was deep and enduring. Wallace's execution created a shared trauma that became part of the nation's collective memory. It unified communities not through victory, but through suffering. The horror of his death became a source of resolve, reinforcing the belief that dignity could survive even the most extreme degradation. The method of execution itself, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was a declaration of power. Reserved exclusively for traitors, it represented the ultimate betrayal of the bond between ruler and subject. By imposing it on Wallace, Edward I was asserting a sweeping claim that all inhabitants of the British Isles were his subjects, regardless of consent or allegiance. Equally important was the public nature of the punishment. Medieval justice was not discreet, it was performative. Executions were designed to instruct as much as to punish, reinforcing hierarchy through spectacle. Wallace's death stands as one of the most elaborate examples of this tradition. A carefully staged event intended not only to destroy a man, but to discipline an audience through fear. The crowd was not simply observing justice, it was actively participating in a ritual of state authority. The meticulous records surrounding Wallace's execution make it clear that English officials knew they were staging something meant to endure. Every element, from the carefully chosen route of the procession to the final placement of his severed body parts, was documented with intention. This was not a spontaneous act of vengeance. It was a calculated performance designed to be remembered, a narrative constructed to reinforce English dominance long after Wallace himself was gone. The broader European context cannot be ignored. Medieval Europe was tightly interconnected, and reputation carried real political weight. News of Wallace's execution spread quickly across the continent, witnessed by foreign observers and relayed through diplomatic and clerical networks. The message was unmistakable. England was prepared to employ extreme brutality to enforce its authority. That reputation would shape diplomatic perceptions for years, influencing how other powers viewed English rule and its methods. Confronting the reality of Wallace's execution forces an uncomfortable reckoning with human nature and power. The people who gathered to watch his suffering were not aberrations or monsters. They were ordinary citizens conditioned to accept and even celebrate the public destruction of another human being when sanctioned by the state. Their enthusiasm exposes how easily cruelty becomes acceptable once it is framed as justice. Perhaps even more disturbing than the violence itself is how routine it had become. The executioner was not improvising. He was a trained professional, experienced in maximizing pain while prolonging life. The officials who organized the event were administrators following established legal procedures. Extreme cruelty had been normalized, absorbed into the machinery of governance. That normalization reveals just how thin the veneer of civilization can be. Finally, Wallace's transformation from defeated insurgent to enduring martyr highlights the unpredictability of political symbolism. Edward I intended the execution to extinguish resistance by demonstrating its cost. Instead, he created a symbol of sacrifice that would inspire defiance. The spectacle meant to crush hope ultimately preserved it, turning terror into legacy. In the end, it was the sheer excess of the execution that undermined its purpose as a deterrent. The brutality was so total, so overwhelming that it crossed a threshold and became something almost mythic. What was meant to terrify instead transcended fear, transforming into a symbol larger than the act itself. The enduring power of Wallace's story speaks to a deep human need for figures who embody moral courage, especially when that courage is tested through unimaginable suffering. His death demonstrates that the most decisive victories are not always won on battlefields. Sometimes they are moral victories, forged in moments when dignity survives, even as the body is destroyed. Wallace's execution ultimately confronts us with the true cost of freedom and the price of principle. In the comfort of the modern world, it is easy to forget that many of the liberties we now consider ordinary were purchased through blood, pain, and sacrifice. His death stands as a stark reminder that freedom has never been free, and that those who inherit it bear a responsibility to remember the suffering that secured it. That is why Wallace's story remains relevant. The tools of oppression may evolve, but the struggle between domination and liberty does not disappear. His execution forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. There are values worth enduring suffering for, and causes that demand courage even in the face of death. Each generation must decide for itself where it stands when faced with that choice. The cobblestones of medieval London may be long washed clean, but the message carried in Wallace's blood still echoes through history. Some principles demand any price, and even when the human body is broken, the spirit can endure, strong enough to inspire others to continue the fight long after the night has fallen.